Product Quest podcast. Thank you for joining us on our journey to better understand innovation and product strategy. My name is Scott Burleson, and joining me, as always, my co-hosts Jan Vermouth and Jonathan Edwards. And today we're going to keep it to just our Product Quest podcast team, and we're going to explore a topic of personal interest for sure, and I think one that a lot of folks, certainly practitioners, even if you're doing jobs to done projects or if you're hiring folks to do them, I think this is an important topic, and it's what can go wrong? What are the challenges you have with executing a job to be done project? And I'll just open it up to our panel here. Maybe I'll start with you, Jan. You were sharing a few things as we were getting ready. And I don't know that you have to have any, just like with a good qualitative interview, don't feel like you have to come up with the most important thing, whatever is top of mind. What are some of the challenges you found when doing a job to be done project?
All right, so I'll start to blabber on, and then you just kind of interrupt me. So I think there is kind of two things that can go wrong. Or two kinds of things that can go wrong. I think on the one hand you have this more technical stuff. So how exactly do you run a job to be done an interview? How exactly do you phrase a job and all these kinds of things? And I think we can get into that. So where can this go wrong? Maybe there's three buckets. And then there's the second one, I think, whether it's more kind of support things that you need to do, for example, recruiting, and how do you get access to participants? How do you actually access your customer? Sometimes that is difficult for our clients. And then the third bucket, which I'm becoming more and more aware of over the years, actually, is everything that needs to be in place on a more kind of organizational, maybe cultural level. I don't know exactly how to phrase it yet, so that a jobs to be done project can actually succeed, is actually accepted within the company. And just this year, I had a beautiful example of where this horribly went wrong, because we in a sense underestimated the pushback in a certain sense of the organization against this new kind of thinking. So if you bring jobs to be done in a very, very product-centered, a very, very product-oriented company, we kind of underestimated the pushback that we would get from that. And I kind of was too late to realize what game, more or less political, I call it political games, but it's not political games. I mean, they have opinions and they have different kinds of convictions, but kind of I underestimated how much it actually takes so that a jobs to be done perspective even gets accepted sometimes within a company. And that's what I'm kind of struggling the most with and how to actually, how do you manage it? What do you need to do so that it gets acceptance, or broader acceptance, at least within a company?
I think those are the two big categories. It's the executing the project, like my skills that I'm covering, my data analysis, those skills. And then there's the everything else around it. The everything else around it seems to be a bigger cause of failure, just sort of me thinking. Would you agree with that? In other words, it didn't fail because you didn't do a very good job interviewing. It didn't fail because because there was some error in the data analysis. It's almost everything. That's I refer to that as turning the crank, or it's like you're sort of working the process. But I totally agree. It's and you said a lot there. By the way, you said a lot. Some of the things that you mentioned, though, that is issues with getting the results accepted.
Yeah.
And so
even the approach.
Yeah, let's talk about that. What do you mean by you mean acceptance on the approach?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry, I didn't want to. I mean, maybe we can then get actually into the executional questions as well, because I think they're interesting as well. But I think there is challenges in accepting the results. So that is, but then you have
the results.
So that is one kind of challenge, I think. So you run a project, be it qualitative only or with quantitative aspects, that however you want to do it, and then you kind of need to transfer that into a broader audience within the organization. So that is kind of one challenge. So how do you, because what we sometimes had, and we found ways of dealing with this, but what we sometimes had is You do a jobs to be done study, qualitative interviews, quantitative part, and then you show the data. People look at the data and say no. Well, they don't explicitly say no, but they look at the data and still do something else. So that it's kind of, how do you actually manage acceptance of the data? And there's a couple of things that you can do there on how to do this. I was just reminded yesterday, I read another completely different thing about this, and I think I forgot the name of the Greek guy. I think it was the first kind of rhetoric trainer. Yeah, you can Google it very quickly. But he said there's kind of the three ways of persuasion: logos, ethos, and pathos. So logos is appeal to logic, reason, data, facts, whatever. Then ethos is kind of my authority, or because I'm an expert. So kind of this more credibility kind of empowering. And pathos is emotion. And I think what we as Ventbridge, as the company that I work in, is we were heavy on logos. And I think jobs to be done sometimes can be very heavy on logos, on data and logic and everything. But that's not everybody gets convinced in that way. Mm-hmm. So you need to find other ways of working, or get people to work with the data so that they're convinced, or that they start forming at least an acceptance. So that's one kind of thing. And then the second one is just getting the approach accepted within the company is sometimes a challenge. And that was, I think, the one that we walked in, the trap that we walked in, that we underestimated the pushback of product people, of people who still, who had this conviction that I know my customer better than they know themselves. Customers are an unreliable source of information. I have a vision and I want to implement it, no matter what customers think, because whatever. And then the pushback that you get we basically were shut down, and that just can happen. So you don't even get acceptance of the approach. I'm sorry,
That's very interesting. I often think of, with the Jobs Be Done project, if we use our jobs language, as we should, or as we can, there's one job of uncovering customer needs. That's sort of what we think of. There's also the job of communicating what we've learned.
Yes.
And if we do the first one, if we do an amazing job of the first one, we do an amazing job, we do a perfect job uncovering customer needs, and we do a terrible job of communicating what we've learned, we have failed.
Yes.
Miserably failed. And I think, by the way, we have to do one of these one day, Jan. We just really go into the philosophers, and we keep talking around it, but we're going to do that. But
we're going back to sneak out of that, but yes, we should.
Your logos, ethos, pathos. I think Jobs Be Done as a process appeals to the logical mind a bit. So it sort of pulls. So we're like, the logic should almost be almost like a scientist. That should be all that matters. And so which is terrible way of thinking. I mean, it draws us in, but when we do that, we minimize the importance of this communication part. And I'll tell you, out of that logos, ethos, pathos, I'll tell you the one I try to never use is that ethos. I try to never. I never want to be like, I'm an authority on this, therefore. I mean, I actively. I mean, I don't have to actively fight against that, because that's just not my personality. But even if like somebody's trying to, in the room, in the conversation, I'm like, look, I'm just a student. I'm just learning. By the way, this is some market, just because I know the process. I'm not an expert in your markets. You've got deep expertise in your products and your customers. And I am super respectful of that. If anybody's an authority, it's not me, it's you, for that matter. But I think that's something we could learn to do better as practitioners, is the pathos, the emotion. Now, I'll tell you one of my tricks there, and I'd be curious to know what you guys think as well. During the qualitative, it's nice to record audio, and if it's a product that they're using, it's not always the easy thing to do, but if you can record video of them using it, and then people think, well, you're doing that because for part of taking notes. And transcripts are good for notes. I don't need video that much for notes, really. The video is I'm thinking about when I'm communicating this later. If this thing they're having trouble with, I want to show this video of of this situation, of this context. Now with things like tractors, that's super fantastic because you can get out there and show some things. Like if you're studying an insurance process, watch this guy, he's having trouble with his Excel sheet. It doesn't always work the same, but I haven't used it as much as I'd like to. Quite honestly, it's just a lot of work to do the video, and I've used to be better at it. But if you're able to capture it, the sort of the cheaper way of doing it is you just display the customer's quote on the screen, and that's something. It's better than nothing. But the video works.
Yes.
Works very well.
We do exactly the same thing. So we, as far as there was a couple of more laws that you have to respect now with privacy and everything like that. But whenever we can, we capture the video recording and with the consent of the participant, and then showing the actual clip. Showing the clip of where the customer states their problem, where they say it, it's just, and that's ethos. Right. So it's just another layer of because that convinces people. You cannot challenge it anymore. They said it. It's there. So, and the quote is kind of like another level, and we do that as well. So if we can, we try to manage and find clips where they support, where they exactly say an outcome statement or a job metric or however you want to call it. They say, you see, the list that we've captured, behind each of those is a clip like that. And that immediately gets acceptance. So that is, in a sense, that is probably more the ethos part. And that's one thing. The other thing that we encourage to do, and with varying degree of success, to be honest, is we invite everybody that we can to watch us do the interview. I mean, they have busy schedules. Usually they're unable to take the time. But if they can, join the interview, sit in on it. We explain a little bit what we do, because it can be a job to be done interview can look very weird if you're heavily solution focused in your job. So you kind of need to understand a little bit what we're actually doing. But then we invite as much as we can people to sit in, and we had designers and engineers sitting in on our interviews, and they were starting to draw. So that was a nice example back when you actually met people. So it wasn't digital. It was in Italy. It was a work for a car manufacturer, and we brought in engineers, and they sat behind the mirror while we were doing the interviews, and they started to draw these new designs. So whenever a problem came up, they started sketching, and that's another way of just finding ways of basically getting people to listen to the customer, is try to get them into your interview if you can.
I would think it would be super important to get them to understand the approach prior to so,
because it can blow back.
Well, it's like it's definitely, I get why it's good to do. I'd stop short of saying it's my preference, because in traditional market research, one of the accepted norms is the client will keep, like if you're in a focus group behind the glass, well, they'll keep sending in questions. They want to send in questions. And the time for them to send in questions, in my opinion, was during the scoping. It's not during this conversation. Now, I don't know if I'm in some controversial space, but I've got this limited time with this customer. I know what I'm going for. Now, I think it'd be totally fair to say, hey, look what we've learned, and we're missing this. I don't know that's the right answer, to be honest with you. I don't, maybe I should be more welcoming of the comments. I mean, I can think of one a long time ago. It was like 10 years ago, and the client sitting next to me, she wasn't behind glass. And after the interview, the client said, let's talk about how these are going. And so he wanted to evaluate it. And I was like, I don't want to talk about how these are going. They're going fine. I mean, but the client at that time, the individual, they had questions, they had things they wanted
Yeah.
but here's the problem. That person's bringing their own jobs to be done baggage into the situation. And that may or may not be related to the project. So to me, to just sort of circle back to another cause of failure, it's early on. It's setting the scope. And it's and again, I'm trying to learn to do all this better too, but it's to make sure when you're setting the scope that whoever the reasonable stakeholders are, all of them getting all of their input. What do they need to learn? What are their but usually what will happen is, well, there's all these things we want to learn, and then I'm just sort of like, okay, well, to learn all of these things, our sample size just blew up because look at all this variability. You want us to do 60 qualitative interviews? We'll do that. But I'm going to argue. I don't think it's not my recommendation. So let's rescope it and end up here with a more reasonable set. So, but they don't know. They don't know the consequences of I want this. I want this. I want this. But when scoping is finished, I want everybody. Everybody might not like the scope, but I want everybody to know what it is. And at least so that
nice.
when we get to the end and here's the results, at least it's not going to, we studied this job. We studied the job of mowing the lawn. We have all these outcomes for mowing the lawn, and it's about the mowing the process. And so we didn't learn about storing the mower. We didn't do those consumption jobs. We didn't learn about maintaining the mower, changing the fluid. We didn't learn about the buying process. All of that was out of scope. We studied more. And so to me, it's critical that they understand what it is, so that when the end is there, they're not gonna be like, well, you didn't get this, you didn't get that. But once we have that, again, I don't know that this is the right answer, but
I think we can distinguish what can go wrong. We can differentiate between things that are inherent to consulting in general and things that are inherent to to jobs to be done in particular. And I think definitely the scope, I actually had written it down in my notes as something to get into, because in my experience, this is a big part of the issues of the issue is defining the scope correctly and managing expectations correctly. And as you mentioned, Scott, getting everyone involved at the beginning so that they know what to expect. And actually, I was wondering for you guys, I mean, what would be part of the scope? I mean, what are the deliverables of a jobs to be done project? I mean, of course, I guess it is a bit different if you're coming in as a consultant or if you're doing this for yourself within your company.
I think one question, and I would be interested in kind of, so I totally agree, Jonathan, that there's a couple of like external consulting questions that come up, but then there is, if you're internal as well, and I wonder how you both see this. So there is a kind of chicken and egg thing going on probably, and I don't know how exactly we solve this, but we do. But where do you start? I mean, on the one hand, you need to define a target group. And by defining a target group, you kind of also define in a certain way what the job is. Or do you start with the job and then look for the target group? Or do you start with the product and then go out looking for what kinds of jobs could be addressed? So there is, I think, kind of triangulation that needs to go on. And you need to learn how to do this. But how do you solve this for different challenges? I mean, at one point, you need to say, this is the target group, this is the job, this is but how do you get there?
It's a great question.
I think here we're going beyond the
beyond the scope.
You're diving directly deep into some of the most profound questions in jobs to be done. I think, how do you define the market is definitely a tough one.
I think part of it is, John, you described different starting points and different ways of getting there. I mean, I personally tend to start with a product because I think it's just it's an easier beginning point. I don't know that that's the right one. But it's just like, that's usually what's on sort of the customers, the client in this case, that's sort of what's on their mind. So you sort of start where they are. And I think it's a good place to start because, but I think the thing that the error is not providing enough time for that conversation. And sometimes it's like, all right, we want to start interviewing on this date. I mean, somebody in the process becomes real like, all right, we gotta drive towards timelines. The end.
Yes.
And it's just like, it's just like, I think if you take enough time, you can get there. And so in the old days, framing was always done on site. And it was like, and I would actually send over a list of homework, answer these questions. Nobody likes to do that homework, by the way. They're like, well, you're working for us. You're giving us work. But I don't know what your innovation goals are. I mean, I don't know what I need to get that. So to bring that, and then we'll have this on-site meeting. And I haven't quite figured out what's ideal in a post-COVID world. What I've been doing is having like a series of like 2 to 3 hour sessions, because people get tired after that. And sort of like we keep going until we're done. Nobody likes that answer. We keep going till you're done, but here's the thing.
But it's the right answer.
On their end, there's gonna be disagreements about what it should be, and they don't even know they disagree yet. And so getting the conversation started, it uncovers these disagreements. And me on the outside, I have no idea how long it will take to get them to consensus. How can I possibly predict that? So I can't predict how long it takes. I mean, in practice, I don't know, maybe 8 hours or something. I don't know. What about you, Jan? How do you do framing? How do you set it up? I mean, just like logistically, and when do you know it's done?
Yeah. So, I mean, it really depends. Usually we say we need to align on 3 questions. What's the target group? What's what we call the job hierarchy, which is kind of a job map, but it has different layers. So what is that? And what's the business intention?
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of, so I think in a sense, in a general way, probably there isn't an answer, but in a concrete case, and the third point, so what's the business intention, is where we usually start.
Okay.
We can discuss all the rest later on, but we need to understand and ensure a link to the business. What is it that you actually want? And that's where we usually come in and say, okay, you want to grow the number of users, for example. That's a business goal. Fine. Yeah. Okay. In order to achieve that business goal, what's the target group? What's the job then? So I feel like, but that's not always as clear cut as I put it now, because exactly there's disagreement on the business intention as well sometimes. So you need to manage this. And it's also not always that clear how to translate the business intention into a specific target group, because it can be very big. But that's where we usually start. So we want to understand what the business results are, and then work our way backwards from there, basically.
I like that. Now, is the business intention, would it be fair to say it's sort of a higher level job to what we want to study?
Yeah.
Or not? Or you would say that?
Although it's on the company side, isn't it? It's the business intention.
Yes. Let me think about that one. So I think parallel.
There is. Well, let me just talk through so if let's just say it's to, I mean, maybe an example would be to
we can take to mow the lawn.
What's that?
We can take, let's say, to mow the lawn.
Okay, so in that case, we're making lawnmowers, and so we want to sell more lawnmowers. I mean, or grow our share of a certain segment. And then how are we going to do that? You could think about it. I still like the old fishbone diagram, honestly. So it's sort of, job hierarchy goes up and down. Fishbone goes from one side to the other. So if we put at the top here of our fishbone, sell more mowers, within all these bones, one of them is going to be, we don't understand what people need so their challenge is mowing the lawn, therefore we want to study the job of mowing the lawn.
Yeah.
Am I seeing that correctly? Is the way you would think about it?
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, there is a part of it needs to go into this framing that has nothing to do with jobs to be done. And it's, and is exactly understanding what's the goal, the business goal that you want to achieve, and what's exactly standing in the way? Because it's not always the case that improving the product, for example, is the problem to increasing for example to grow revenues, whatever. Then that's a bit of a vague goal, but you know what I mean. So sometimes it's you need another ways of figuring out, hey, by the way, we have an issue in the buying process.
Yes.
So we need to study that process.
Yes.
And it's not always so clear cut, right? But it also depends on, if you want to say, I mean, it depends also on the level of the project itself. So is it more strategic? Is it rather attached to a product or a product category? So there's a lot of variables, I think, that go in there, which, yeah, maybe it's not that always clear cut, but.
And I think on the client side, they might not have even asked these questions. And somebody might be thinking, oh, we need a 10-year strategy. Somebody else is thinking, no, I need to know what features my product has next year. And
both are probably legitimate things. Like,
yeah.
I actually had another question that's kind of connected to this, but maybe goes back a bit in what we're discussing at the beginning, which is, and I've got another connected question to that, which is, what are the modes of failure? I mean, what does it mean actually for a jobs to be done project to fail for you guys? I mean,
my short answer would be that I have two. One is that it's perceived as a failure by the customer. If they say it's a failure, quite frankly. And the other one would be is, even if they don't say that, but it just becomes research. It becomes a binder on a shelf. It just becomes a PowerPoint presentation in the folder that's not used. I think if either one of those happens, it's a failure. My short answer.
So does the process sometimes stop in the middle? So does it happen that the client just says, okay, this is going nowhere, we'll just stop? Or is it mostly the case that it'll end up in a binder and no one's going to do anything with it?
Well, that hopefully that's not mostly the case without.
No, but I mean, no, mostly in the, within the failures.
The percentage of failures.
Within the failures. I'm not talking, of course, about all the wonderful successes you guys have.
I'm still hoping one succeeds eventually.
No, I'm talking within the failures.
No, sorry. No, I know what you, so I think I have nothing to add. Scott, you nailed this. I mean, it's these two things. In my experience, and it rarely stops in the middle of the project, because I mean, it doesn't make sense. So either you don't even start, which I think is fine sometimes even. So sometimes that can be a good decision not to even start, or then you do the project, you present it in the end, and there's just no one or nothing is there that they won't pick it up. They won't do anything with it. And I remember a that once say through, and it was some, I don't know, 8-9 years ago at least, where we suddenly felt, after kind of doing the first couple of interviews, we realized the job that we're getting done for our client is prove to my boss that I'm actually doing something. And then, so it's just creating work, doing something. And then we realized, okay, it's not about having impact and actually changing something for the customer, changing the product, whatever you want, but it's just and then that's a really hard thing. I mean, then we say, okay, what can we do to bring this over the finish line? And we always deliver on the result, but sometimes you have that case where, kind of it lands in nowhere, and that's what we're really trying to avoid. And I think usually we more often have the case that we don't even start, and then maybe, or there is, so in these 10 years that I am at Vembridge, I think we had 2 or 3 where I mean, sometimes I don't know, but 2 or 3 where I really know nothing happened. So nothing really, it was nice presentation. Everybody had a smile. We walked out of the workshop room and nothing happened. So yeah.
Yeah. That on the back end, I think sometimes I always encourage folks to, when they get the results, don't plan, like if the presentation's on Tuesday, don't schedule ideation for Wednesday.
No.
I think you need some time to read it, think about it, just immerse yourself in it. What's the other research your company has? Where does it is it in sync with that, or is it where are the conflicts? You've gotten data and now you need to absorb it. And that's one thing I really love about your model, Jan, is the spinning to growth. That your process doesn't end with the uncovering of the needs, as is pretty common, really, but at least you provide a path. Say, hey, let us continue working with you to help you to use it. And I love that about what you guys do. I'd love to know at some point. I'd love to have us a whole show on that spinning part sometime.
Sure. And so one issue I had when I was doing consulting, so I'm not a jobs to be done consultant, but one thing that we faced was the notion of return on investment, basically. So for the client, I mean, this is a valid concern, both when you're selling your services as a jobs to be done consultant or any other consultant, but also further down the line, of course, when you want when people want to validate your work and try and understand if you did a good job. If you're providing these kinds of services, often you're kind of removed from the result, right? Because there's a big step between the moment. I mean, you're basically framing the problem, and then there's maybe a few years before anything comes out, or and can they really tie it back to this or not anymore? And so, how do you actually go over that hurdle of of really connecting the value that they get in their hands with the work you've done?
Yeah. Do you want to go first, or
I want you to go first?
That's a really, I mean, that's a tough one. That's a tough one because sometimes you can't. To be quite frank, you can't strictly bring that back to a number and then say that's the amount of, because that's not how decisions work. That's not how organizations work, and especially how not innovation goes. In other cases, you can. So, I mean, it's there's one case right now when I'm walking through the city of Zurich, where I live. I see billboards, and I know exactly why the billboards look the way they look, because it's based on a project that we did. And you couldn't be, I mean, I'm so happy every time I see one of those billboards, and there you can actually, they are now tracing it back. So that's there. I mean, it's a health insurance, and they're tracking top of mind and all that kind of, they have different metrics where they track how well is their campaign doing. Now, of course, not everything in that campaign is due to our project. There's a lot of design work that went into which completely different company did another. So it's hard to judge what exactly is the amount of, well, that our project brought in growth of clients, but there is a relationship there. But it's hard to pinpoint, and sometimes you can't.
Yeah, I mean, this is a typical problem with marketing and advertising, of course.
Yeah, it is. I think it is. That's a good way to look at it, Jonathan. Like the things that, I mean, what's your return of investment on a commercial, or on a billboard, or on anything? You guys are actually, Jonathan, you recommended a really good book recently, The Book of Why, on causality, and I'm just enjoying that.
Beautiful book.
Very much. But sort of gets into this question: how do you know one thing caused another? And one thing I loved about the book is that he beats up on the statisticians, which I enjoy. he particularly beats up on them because apparently it's originally one of the goals of statistics, of the early statistical fathers, if you will, was to prove causality, and they sort of gave up. They got to the point where we can show these things are correlated, but it's just like they literally, and everybody that's a high school student that's been through a statistics class will tell you that correlation doesn't mean causation. I'm like, stop it. You hear it all the time, and somebody will say it, and they'll they'll reflect to let you absorb this profundity they've given this proverb. But he beats up on him from this, and the element he brings back into it is logic. Is don't expect the numbers to answer every question for you. If a father and son both have blue eyes, right? You could say that conceivably the father's eyes, had a causal impact on the son's. But you can also, that's as a possibility, just as a possibility. But you can also say it's an impossibility that the son's eyes caused the father's to be blue, right? Yeah. And so, I'm early in the book, but one of the big lessons to me is that just because numbers, we don't just stop with data analysis. We have to combine logic with it. And often when I'm asked about the return on investment question, I don't think I've ever given an answer anybody enjoyed or liked, because I don't have a number. But it's like, if you were going to, this is a military example, it's just only when it comes to vines, but if you were going to bomb a manufacturing facility, this facility is making tanks and planes, right? What's the return on your investment to determine where that plant is exactly? How much is that going to cost? Do we need to do that? No, just send the bombers, just start letting them fall. I mean, that's a logical argument for getting your target. If you better understand your target, you've got a better shot of hitting it. And nobody finds that very satisfying.
I find that, but I think it's a great. I think that connection you've made is really very nice, and exactly. I mean, the one of the main points in this Judea Pearl makes is exactly this: that data alone will not inform you on causation, and so you need to have a model to be able to reflect on causation. Right. You need a model or a logic, right? And I think it's exactly right. I mean, it's a very nice connection you've made there between the idea that okay, you can go in and talk about the data and everything, but in the end, you need to present a worldview and an explanation that people will go along with, and that they'll find compelling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and let's not forget, and I think Christensen was 100% right on this, to say that he said the job to be done explains the cause of why a customer acts in a certain way. So nothing that's social demographic about it. So I think that's probably why jobs to be done people are drawn to causality as a concept, and that maybe gets a little bit into this philosophy aspect of it, because I think it's 100% right. The job explains the cause why somebody acts in a certain way, because they want to achieve the job. It's the purpose that they want to achieve explains their actions. It's the same way where you say, and Judea Pearl brings, he mentions that example. So because with causality, we often think that it's chronologically, so the cause is prior to the effect, but that's not always the case. For example, Christmas gift sales go up before Christmas. Exactly. So it's the job of, I want to gift something to my mother, my father, whoever. I just need to, right? I need to buy a gift that so it's the future that causes present action. And I think jobs to be done has a kind of a similar logic. What I want to get to is I want to mow the lawn, right? That's the thing I want to do. I want to have the lawn mowed. You can phrase it in a different way, but it's the same thing. And that causes me to go through certain steps. And I think that's basically the model of jobs to be done, and why it's so powerful, because it brings causality as an explanation to action.
Then the next question is obviously then, how do you get to the model? And I mean, in this whole causal framework, this is not actually a question in this particular book, in the Book of Why, that it's really answered. The models are basically given, and there's a whole other kind of parallel field, which is called causal discovery, where people actually try to figure out how can we actually discover models. And you can partially get to some models by through having data and stuff like this. I mean, the main way you'd get through a model is by doing experiments and acting in the world. I mean, that's one of the core ideas, is that you, through acting in the world and and seeing, okay, what happens if this doesn't happen, will this still happen? And for that, you need to hold something still virtually and so hold a few variables still and see if things happen, and then you can make a model. But I just read a quite nice little book, and it's unfortunately or fortunately, I don't know, in French, but it was an excellent book called Petite Victoire from a guy called I think Philip Silbertsan. It's called Small Victories, and it's based on the idea of effectuation, basically. But the basic argument of the book is that if you want to change the world and if you want to change people's opinions, what you need to do is bet on very small actions, extremely small actions, and you actually select your actions based on your ability to go through with them and have them be successful. And you work on the mental models or on the worldviews or the models that people have by doing these really small actions that you're sure to be successful at, that will change people's view on stuff. And as we were discussing, I was actually wondering, so this would be another way to convince people. So what would be like a really small project? Say if someone's in an organization and wants to go through a jobs to be done project, what could be like a really small thing that people could do where they're practically sure of getting a kind of quote unquote victory or success that might, make people say, okay, that's an interesting thing. I don't know if that's even possible, but it just occurred to me.
Oh no, it is. I think it is. I don't know if you want to go first, Scott, but I think it is, and it's very important to have ways to do this. I mean, there's. Sorry, do you want to go? I don't want.
I'm still curious what you're going to say, but I know one thing that at least a fellow practitioner I know is trying is to have, instead of a long 3 or 4 month project, he has like these 1 week sprint, and it's sort of an accelerated project. Clearly won't have the statistical power or whatever, but at least it's probably, and one of your things was to get people to accept the approach, maybe at least get them to see A to Z about the approach, and you learn something useful. You always learn something useful. The other thing I would say is it's a lot of pressure to say, based on this one study, you'll have the answer to everything and it solves everything. I think, no, combine it, take everything, all your other studies. This is just because this becomes part of the puzzle. It doesn't replace everything you've done. And there are definitely some companies and practitioners that would disagree with what I said. They'd say, no, this study does everything. I don't say that. I say it should complement your knowledge. I don't know. What were you going to say, Jan?
Yeah. Well, what you can do is, and it depends on the company, right? But sometimes what we do is we just do half a day framing workshop. So we do nothing else but spend time on the framing workshop, have a discussion on exactly this, and then reframe it from the jobs to be done perspective. And that I mean, it depends on where the company stands, but that is a very tiny first step. And then you can show kind of, okay, look, now we kind of set it up. This is what you would get, and this is what you would understand. And that can be a very tiny first step of just do a job map, and it can be very rudimentary, and that's okay. But just because I think we underestimate sometimes, and I certainly do this, we underestimate the what it takes to actually switch the perspective. And not because jobs to be done is so intellectual and blah blah blah. That's not the thing. I rather think that people are living in a context within organizations where they're trained to think in a very different way, in a solution-oriented way, and so just having half a day where you get out of that context and are free to think in a new way, in a jobs to be done way, is a first little start that you can do. It probably won't have that much of an impact, but it will kind of start at least a discussion. Maybe things can grow from there. But don't underestimate that. This is going back to what I started with. Don't underestimate the groundwork it sometimes can take to bring that kind of user-centric, whatever you want to call it, thinking into an organization. I sometimes underestimate that a lot.
Yeah, agree. And a lot of times, there'll be a champion on the inside, super excited,
yeah, exactly,
ready to go.
Yeah.
And almost, and they're wonderful. You're not there without them. but you have to bring everybody else along. You have to connect it to their job to be done. And
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah,
Should we go on to the more technical stuff that can go wrong for a couple of minutes?
sure,
Or
sure. I think we've covered the human side of it quite a bit. Yeah, what are some of the technical things?
if only there weren't so many humans involved,
I
everything would
know,
be.
I know. Uh, this would be super easy if it wasn't for clients and customers. It'd be very easy.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. So I think I don't know how it is about you, Scott. I see two key things that can go really wrong, or that are underestimated. Maybe not wrong, but they're underestimated. The amount of time it takes to really come up with a good, we call it job hierarchy or job map, really the framing of the job. I think that can go quite wrong in different ways. And we spoke about this a little bit in prior episodes. I think there is a tendency to go too high and to be too narrow. And I can explain a little bit what that means, but I think very often if people, especially if they hear the word purpose, think very, very, very abstract. So they get from mowing the lawn to, oh, that's about what was your example? I think beautifying my home, for example, or
Yeah,
having,
sure.
and then you get from beautifying my home is to live a peaceful life or whatever. So really, and then people think too far ahead. They're almost like too far away from the solution.
So could you
from
maybe
where
summarize what the risks are of going too, just reiterate what in your view are the problems if you go too high or too low?
So the problem with going too high is you will lose the connection to your business, to your actual organizational context. So if you have factories that produce lawnmowers, it will take quite some time to get into the business of developing solutions that help people live a peaceful life. That's a very far stretch. And sometimes that can be nice to think about it. But so if you go too high, you will be too detached from the actual business. If you go too narrow, too low, is you will only stay in very, very optimizing something very, very narrow. Now that in itself is not something bad. That can be a very fine purpose. And I think honestly, the narrower you actually scope, the more you will be able to do with the results. So, so these are kind of the risk. I think if you go too high, it's too detached from the business. If you're too narrow, it's just about optimizing.
Mm-hmm. And what are the ways of going too narrow then? I mean, how do you actually, what does it mean really to go too narrow? Because I mean, maybe I should just say how I would see it, and you can tell me what you think about it. Because I mean, I think there's different. There's different ways to go too high or too narrow, and so there is you can choose a different beneficiary and define the benefit, or let's say the executor of the job. Sorry, in a more or less abstract manner. So basically you can narrow with context, and I think this is something you actually talk quite a bit about in your book, The Statue in the Stone, Scott, which I really liked, on this idea of context. And context, it seems to me, I'll just go with that. I'll say that's one very interesting way of narrowing or abstracting the job. And context can be constraints that the customer has. It can be how you define actually your job executor. It can be the job hierarchy. So I think we also discussed this at some point, that if you're doing an action, if you're doing a job for one reason, for one higher level reason, it changes. It will not be the same thing as if you do that same job for another higher level reason. For instance, we talked about cooking meals, and if you're cooking a meal for your family, or if you're cooking a meal
to impress a lady,
or something, it'll change. Of course, it gives a context. So the higher level jobs also provide a context. And so I think I think context is one way of being more narrow in the job. and I'm kind of getting lost a bit in what I wanted to say. So I don't know if you wanted to comment on that already.
Well, I think Jan and I would agree that if we had to pick too high or too low, we'd go too narrow. Because we're erring on actionability. Because remember, even our earlier definition of a failure it's stuff on a shelf, and so something. Just stick with the lawnmower. I apologize. I know I keep dragging you guys into these lawnmower examples, but like one would be. Change the lawnmower blade. That's pretty, that's almost ridiculously narrow. It's, but you could have what are the steps of changing a lawnmower blade? How do you prepare? What materials do you gather together? And how do you know when you're ready to change? You could totally do it, but you're not going to learn anything about mowing the lawn. So you're going to get this amazing, but who knows? But me on the outside, who am I to say that's too narrow? Maybe that's like where the big opportunity could be. And something that we sort of mentioned earlier is it's a lot of pressure to put on any one study. A lot of times the answer is you need to study maintain the mower, you need to study mow the lawn, you need to study the purchasing cycle of buying a mower. The answer is you need to study lots of things, and everybody doesn't like that because then it just feels overwhelming. It's like, it feels overwhelming. But I think that's probably the answer. So usually with framing, it's about, or scoping. Jonathan, I really like your thought about I hadn't thought about it that way, but it's really not that different than a typical consulting and a client where you're just determining the scope of work, what's in, what's out. It's very it's very similar to that. In fact, maybe I'm thinking I may need to read some references on how that's done. Might get some insight. But I think I've gone way past your question. Your question is about too narrow. I definitely err on too narrow because it makes it more actionable. But the trade-off is it's with all of these things you have to study, if you study everything at those narrow levels, maybe to understand this market, maybe that's like 20 projects where, if you can abstract it up a bit, maybe we can cover it all in 5 or something less. So I think that's the cost of going too narrow is you have a lot more work to do to understand what's going on in this space.
Yeah. There is also, I really like this. You mentioned this a couple of times, I think in other discussions, maybe even here on the podcast already, where you, Scott, said, well, sometimes clients react and say, oh, that all sounds very complicated. And your response is, well, it is complicated. That's just the way, that's the way it actually is. And I think that's 100% right. I think there is another way in which you can go kind of, maybe it's the same way, but just the flip side. And Tony used to use this example quite a lot with so the iTunes, and like how did actually iTunes come about? So the one narrowness that you can do is just narrow in on a step within the job. So that's kind of what you were referring to, changing the blade. That's a very narrow thing. But then it could also be too narrow in thinking about or not thinking about stuff that has to happen before the job can start and stuff that happens afterward, after the job is done. There is always an after. So that's at least how we think about it. So there's an up and down, and there is a left and right. There is a before and after. And Tony does this way better job of explaining it, but he shows that, well, the invention of iTunes is not in kind of, the improvement is not along the lines of quality of music, for example. It's not about having a better quality of sound or whatever. They actually did it one step prior to listening to actually the music better, which was the organization. Finding a specific song was done much better in the Apple ecosystem than in any other. And sometimes it happens that I see if clients or just companies that we might work with try to apply jobs to be done themselves, is that they forget steps that are not covered by their solution. So this really, and that I think can be really a source of error, where you only start when your product comes in. But the job usually, not always, but usually the job is bigger than the thing you're actually serving.
Wow, that's a huge point.
Yeah.
You've got me thinking about a project I'm working on right now. The Jan, so for whatever like is most critical, will you, with the scope of the project, will you generally push it to make sure you include a few steps before and a few steps after, even if that's sort of beyond what they're interested in?
We try, yes, we try to bring that in, because I mean, so we differentiate. We say, let's do a hypothesis, and then in the end it's the customer that's going to steer us in the right direction, but we need to have this openness to be able to go there. I mean, I think anyone that actually practices jobs to be done, they will realize that if you were to start talking to people about listening to music, let's say, customers would, if you have an open ear and really just say, how do you do this? And then you stay open on what the process is and the solutions that are used, the problem of organizing the songs will come up. So we have this kind of tendency to say, we need a kind of hypothesis, but that's a lot of it is about alignment. So getting alignment within the team that we say, okay, here's where we start, here's where we stop. That's the level of altitude. So we use the hierarchy as a kind of alignment tool. And then it's really the customer. I mean, we trust that they will steer us in the right direction if there is a problem a little bit outside of our scope.
If it's still scoped there, will you, let's just say whatever the scope is, will you in an interview, will you still push a little bit beyond it, a little bit before and a little bit after?
You can try. Yeah, so we try, but it's not, to be honest, it's not a systematical thing that we do. But I mean, we usually put that up. So we do this hierarchy, and we usually try to put a step in that is before, that is out of scope, and we put the step in that is out of scope on kind of the afterwards thing as well. Right. And then in the interviews, so we make sure we cover the core, and then we start fishing a little bit around. Maybe there is something there, and if there is, we try to go there, but it's not you don't do this systematically, let's say, or as a yeah.
So you allow for a little flexibility during the qualitative to move the boundaries in and out a bit. I think that's a good thing to do as you're learning things, right? Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. There's another issue I want to bring up. Maybe, well, looking at the time, I don't know, but just as a message to people out there that want to start their own jobs to be done project, do not underestimate recruiting. I think we all get so in love with theories and everything, but the sheer practicality of, if you want to do it yourself, I mean, there is agencies out there that you can pay and then they will organize that stuff, but it costs money. And if you want to do it yourself, I'm in a project right now where this is just an issue. Getting actual respondents, people, and organizing all of these different interviews, having that in a schedule that actually makes sense and that is not over 3 months and everything. Do not underestimate the practicality of just organizing that stuff.
That really is the hardest thing, actually.
That is so hard.
And there's some markets where, like military, there's certain things where, you know, you just, if you can't you call up a recruiter, they can't line them up for you. That's a big, if you have that situation, you need to allow for a lot of time. And you get this in B2B, and that often means going through the salespeople to set up interviews. Give up. Don't do them blind, because you're just making it more difficult. You're just sort of a Scott opinion. And you want to say, hey, this is our company. We've got a relationship. You need whatever you can to get the appointment. I mean, and if it's something a recruiter is able to locate, you're good. It's just money. But if it's not, it's without question, that's the hardest thing. Oh my gosh. Yeah. And I don't know what else to say to that. You just got to allow for a lot of time. And this may be beyond our scope for today, but it would certainly be very difficult to do a quant in that case. Yes. And so there may be cases to where you want to say, you know what, we're going to do a quant, but maybe just with 15 or 20 people, but maybe they're interviews again. Like in my company, we do preference interviews so that you can make sure they're understanding it correctly. You don't have any variability. You want to get rid of all the variables you can.
Yeah.
And you just have to sort of give up on the statistical power. But here's one thing: we beat up with statisticians once already. When you get the numbers, you'll have an asterisk. N equals 20. But don't be ashamed of it. You don't have to apologize for it. Look at the standard Go ahead, and some people would say don't even get numbers from 20 people because blah blah blah, it's insignificant. No, gather them anyway and look at the standard deviations of their responses. If their standard deviations are narrow, you can feel great about it. If they're wide, there's something else going on.
That's what it is. Yeah.
But we're getting into a tricky area for sure. But just to summarize, recruiting, it's difficult.
Yeah.
I think we could go on. But I think it's really interesting. For sure. I think, John, one of you guys had somewhere to be.
I have in
meeting
kind of 20 minutes.
20 minutes, okay.
So.
All right. I think it's we've covered quite a lot of ground here. It's quite nice. So we probably can bring it to a close. What do you guys think?
So in conclusion, jobs we done projects are easy and they're just effortless.
Effortless things. No thinking goes into it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny. I think practitioners were drawn to the logic. We're drawn to the jobs to be done, helping the customer get something done perfectly. We're drawn to these things. And then we have to use these other parts of our brain working with people that might not come as natural. Which that would be, it's certainly doing a project. It's nice if you have a couple people on a team together where you can it's a little more pressure if you're the only practitioner rounding everybody up. If you have a couple people, that's probably something else to think about. And some people probably we all have different abilities at everything. And so we've been sort of talking around the skill of facilitating a group.
That would be another one that we.
If somebody on your team is excellent at that, wow, that'd be a big help.
Yeah. We should. I mean, that's where I want to learn. I mean, that's so key.
So, at what point would that skill come in the process when you're dealing with a client? Is that when you're doing the market selection, or when would that skill of managing a group be particularly useful? That's
where it occurs to me early on. And you got to have some pretty thick skin, when somebody says this isn't going very well, So here's a little tip. The jobs to be done interviews, you can use those all the time. You can use them with your family. You can use them with anybody. Look, if they're giving you feedback, this doesn't make sense. You're not helping them get their job done. You gotta chat with them though. What's frustrating, troublesome, time consuming, what is it let's get to the root of it. That tends to work in a lot of situations. I don't know what you about to say, Jan.
No, I just 100% agree. So, but I mean, this if there is and I think design thinkers are a little bit better at this kind of managing groups or that's at least my experience of. I mean, I had a little bit of a discussion with people who they design what's it called, more inclusive processes. So not in a product sense, but for example, you design a larger part of a town. Now, how should that be constructed? And they kind of manage. So they bring in people from the town, they bring in politics, they bring in politicians, they bring in others, and they manage a more participatory way and I try to learn from them things that I can use, because more and more companies are getting more and more democratized. So you need to kind of manage these different teams and bring them in. And it's a lot about that stuff, which is nothing.
What do you mean democratized, like diverse or what?
No, I mean like less hierarchical. So much more smaller teams that are kind of more independent. Mm-hmm. And if you want to do a project, there is a lot of work that goes into just getting buy-in, having people interested, and how do you get them all in? And that's an area where I really want to learn much more. Not that good at it yet, but I'll try to improve. As always with jobs to be done people.
That's right. That's right. All right. We want to pull it together.
Yeah, I'd love to. Well, here's the good thing, I will never forget this, Scott. When we did kind of the first webinar together, kind of where we made the good mistake of meeting half an hour too early, and you said if you get the jobs to be done people in a room, it's like, what do you say, like matches and
a spark and oxygen and fuel, something
exactly
to catch on fire. Well, actually, what I said we probably shouldn't start yet, because we got a lot to talk about. And then we was like 10 seconds went by, and then we just started. We just jumped right in.
So yeah. I think that's so true. I think we could just sit together and then we have lots to talk about. So anyway, I enjoyed it.
Right. I did too. Well, this is fun. I think we'll do more with our Product Quest podcast team. Very, very enjoyable.
Yeah, very nice. Enjoyable. And some great tips from both of you guys. So I learned a lot. Thanks.
As did I. All right. Well, thank you, folks, for yet another hour invested with us, the Product Quest podcast team. I think we will do some more of these with just our group. This was fun. And so then that, friends, concludes today's Product Quest podcast. Please send any comments or ideas for future shows to productquestpodcast@gmail.com, and we will see you next time. We should do more of this. See,
I mean,
it's pretty easy.
Zero preparation, and I thought it was cool.